Am I called to missions? Find out on this week's episode of Redemption Talk. Welcome back to Redemption Talk. My name is Rob Jones. I'm joined with the infamous Roger Stacy. And Roger, I'm so glad to have you here on the show today. And man, just grateful to have you. And we're going to take a second and we're going to talk today just about the call to missions and what that's like. Roger is serving with Redemption Church. You're on the leadership team. You're on the advisory team, really, I guess I should say, for the church plant, for Redemption Church planting. And so, man, we're just so glad to have you today, man. I just want you to know, man, you have been so instrumental in my life. And I know I've not known you, but just for a few years, but brother, you've been so inspirational in my life, and God has certainly used you to encourage me and to help me along. As Jordan and I have prayed through this process of going down to plant in Pensacola, man, you've been so inspirational. But you have a history of missions, is that right?
Right. And thank you for that good word. If anything, it's the Lord working through me. It's not anything I've done, and God placed you in my life, and it's been a joy to fellowship and walk with you in this journey, and to watch you struggle through the call to missions. And I can identify with that. I've been through that process of searching and knowing the will of God. Is God really calling me to missions?
Yeah, man. I think that's a good word, is the struggle, because it is totally a struggle. There have been some breakdown moments, I think maybe in your living room or at lunch. And man, God has certainly used you in my life. And man, I'm grateful just to call you not only my brother in Christ, but my friend. And so Roger, so I know that there's probably some people that are watching this that, and prayerfully will watch this at some point, that maybe you're struggling with that call to missions. Is God calling me specifically to missions? And it is a struggle, like we've talked about. So what I want to do today is I kind of want to talk to you about identifying that. Is God really calling me to missions? So before we kind of dive into that, Roger, why don't you tell them a little bit kind of about your background, where you've served, and your call to missions, and what you've done over the course of your ministry.
Okay. You know, in my life, I have probably three major markers. The first was my salvation when I was born again. The second definite call in my life was when I was 17. God called me to the ministry in high school. And the third would be sitting atop of what is now just no longer exists, the Astrodome in Houston, Texas, at an event on a Wednesday evening at the Southern Baptist Convention, when in that exact moment that night, God definitely called me to missions. And that call of God has remained in my heart to this day. That call never goes away. It lingers. And those were the three major markers in my life. I struggled through those. After graduating seminary, I was trying to determine, what am I going to do? Am I going to pastor? Am I going to pursue a PhD? And I really felt in my heart, God put people and events and places in my life, and just made it very clear that he wanted me on the mission field.
Yeah, so made that clear. So when God called you on the mission field, and I think, is that when you were at the Southern Baptist Convention, is that the story you told me about you and Miss Penny kind of feeling the same call? We'll talk about that in just a minute. But so you surrendered to the ministry. I know you pastored a church for a little while, or maybe a couple of churches. And so you were the pastor, and then you felt God calling you to go to the IMB, the International Mission Board. Tell us a little bit about what that was like, where you served with the IMB.
Yeah. Well, before we went to with the IMB, we moved out west.
That's right.
What today would be called the North American Mission Board, on $600 a month with 2 kids and one born while we were in Utah.
Yeah, but Rod, that was like 1930, man. You could buy a house for $600, right?
Right.
Not quite though.
But it was while we were on our first foreign mission field, really, in the state of Utah, that God began to speak to me about international missions. And then we eventually ended up back in Mississippi. Penny continued her education, and during that time, the Lord brought a missionary from Brazil for a week of missions, and I made a mistake of telling her. I said, Penny and I served before out west in missions, and she said, we need a missionary couple right now in Brazil, and you're just the guy we're looking for. And the Holy Spirit used that in my life to just quicken that call and say, I'm calling you to Brazil. So the Lord called us to Brazil, and after several years in Brazil, when the communism collapsed and the walls fell and the door opened for the gospel in Eastern Europe, the IMB put out a call for 100 missionary units to be willing to transfer and go into Eastern Europe. And we felt God wanted us in Eastern Europe to open up the work in Ukraine. And so we ended up in Western Ukraine in the city of Lviv on the border with Poland. And we were there and served the Lord. And then due to circumstances, we felt a call back to Brazil later on and ended back in Brazil.
Yeah, so spent some time in Brazil and some time in the Ukraine. And actually, Roger, man, just a few months back, several months back, I got to go on my first international mission trip led by the one and only Roger Stacy. And we went to Rio de Janeiro, and man, it was totally life-changing for me. And I think it was life-changing for most of our group who went. And so man, that's incredible. So Roger, let's go back a little bit here. Let's go back and let's talk about that call specifically to the missions. So, God, I think you remember telling you were telling me about you and Miss Penny and you guys being at the Southern Baptist Convention that year and God doing something in your life there and beginning to call you to the missions. Can you tell me about that specific call to the missions?
Well, my wife Penny had always been mission minded, and she'd had a pastor who had been a missionary kid in Brazil, so she was well aware of missions. And I was the kind of guy that God's called me to preach. Don't talk to me about that mission stuff.
I know the feeling.
So during my days in seminary, we had a missionary come to one of my mission classes, and I thought, this is an easy course, I'll just sit here and listen to these stories. And I think I told you this story. He told the story about growing up in Iowa and made a deal with the local farmers that these boys could go out and pick up the leftover grains of corn on the ground and they could sell them for nickels and dimes and quarters. And he said we were content to do that till one day I realized we were standing on the wrong side of the harvest. This guy was harvesting millions of money. He was making money like crazy, and we were making nickels and dimes, and we were on the wrong side.
Yeah.
And God pierced my heart in that class and said, you're on the wrong side of the harvest.
Wow.
And then when we went to the Southern Baptist Convention, God had been working on my life. I had not really shared everything with Penny about that. And we were seated on the missions night on a Wednesday evening at the very top of the dome. And the parade of flags of the nations went across the floor. The North American Mission Board appeal came out and sermons about going to North America, and then parade of flags, the international flags, and Billy Graham brought the message home that evening. And I sat there and turned away from Penny because in that moment I said, Lord, I feel called to go down on that floor and surrender my life to missions. But, my wife's a pastor's wife, and if I go down there and walk down on that floor, she's going to follow me because she's going to go where her husband goes. I said, Lord, if you want her in missions, you got to call her. I never looked at her. I sat there and turned away and wept.
Wow.
And after that service, we got home on a Tuesday. I said, come here, sit down on the couch. I'm coming into my last year of seminary. And I said, I want to tell you what I want to do. And I shared that story. She said, you know what? I was seated there, turned away from you, weeping and saying, God, I know you're calling me to missions, but I know Roger's always said, no, he's going to be a pastor. If you want him in missions, you got to call him. I said, if we just looked at each other, we would have been on that floor right then, surrendered to missions.
Surrendered. Wow. And so you said God, you said you needed God to call Miss Penny.
Right.
And I'm assuming God has called Miss Penny.
Oh, yes. Yes.
So speak to that. Speak to kind of that journey of from that moment forward and God really pricking your heart and convicting you of of missions and what God's calling you to do in that moment, but as a couple because I know there's some people that are watching this that are married and maybe one person feels called, maybe both of
Yeah.
them feel called, but they haven't communicated. Just kind of speak to that. How did that communication look after that time at the convention there? So,
Yeah. Well, you know, we went initially, I graduated and then we moved to Utah in Southeast Utah in the Four Quarters region.
and you guys planted a church out there, right?
we rebirthed the church.
Rebirthed the church,
Yeah,
replanted.
yeah,
You guys did that before that was cool, right?
right. So we did that and moved to South Dakota, Rapid City area. And, you know, we had a call to missions for sure.
Right.
But as we ended up back in Mississippi and pastoring and her working on her degree, during that time, God began to fine tune that call to international. And
Yeah.
so he put people in our lives, missionaries in our lives on stateside assignment,
Yeah.
events, mission events we would attend, people speaking, and just that call never went away.
Right.
It just intensified
Intensify.
among as we shared together. God just confirmed He wanted us on the
Yeah.
international field.
So that, I know, maybe we all know the answer to this, but just for clarification, do you believe that God, when He calls, I mean, I believe that God primarily calls you, right? I mean,
Mhm.
you as a pastor, but do you think God calls both husband and wife when He calls them?
I think if He doesn't call the wife, you will never succeed on the mission field.
Amen.
It's gonna take the call of God for both of you to stay
Amen.
on the field.
Absolutely. And that's been true through our call with the call to plant a church in Pensacola, Florida, and my wife feels tremendously called. And in fact, I can't explain this, I don't know, but it almost seems like my wife has a level of spiritual attunement that I don't necessarily have. I mean, yeah, I mean the spirit, but as far as just being able to clarify, like she would make comments like before we even committed to really thinking about Pensacola, she would make comments like, I feel like the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go in ministry, do some ministry around a base,
Yeah.
to reach the military, and I'm like, nah, you're crazy. We're staying in Ingomar forever, and I think that God affirms those calls through our spouse. Would you
Right.
agree with that?
I agree 100%.
Yeah. So Roger, what would you say to the person who is struggling with a call? Rob Jones several months ago, right? Someone who is struggling with that call to mission specifically. Maybe let's do this in two stages if we can do it. Okay. So number one is the person who has never surrendered to the ministry. Let's make a distinction. There's a call to ministry. There's a call to the mission. So nobody who's ever surrendered to the ministry, maybe they're just a layperson in a church, they're serving, but they feel like maybe God might be calling them to the mission specifically. For that person, what would you say to them? How can you help them get clarity of that call? Is God really calling me to the mission?
Yeah. I think a very important step for anyone that even might remotely think about missions would be, if you've never been on a mission trip, North America, joined a team, a church planning team, financially or prayer, a warrior, or going to the field itself. I think participating in a hands-on mission trip, whether international or home, will help open your eyes, and God will begin to show you a clear path.
Yeah, amen.
The process it's not going to be like I surrender today and tomorrow I'm on the mission field.
Yeah.
It may take 5 years. It may
Sure.
take 6 months, but God will begin a journey. He'll open your heart to missions.
Right. So he begins to open your heart. So that's for the person who's not surrendered to the ministry. They're not serving anywhere as a pastor or an associate pastor or children's director or whatever it is that they're serving in. God begins to prick your heart. So Roger, for the person, maybe it's the same, maybe it's not. For the person who is already serving, like you said, I'm the guy who's called to preach. That's what I'm going to do. I'm serving in a church, and God has laid that burden on them to go and do something in the mission field. what would you say to that person? Somebody who's a pastor, somebody who's a youth pastor, somebody who's a deacon, somebody who's already serving somewhere. For that person, what would you say?
Well, I'd say, first of all, this may blow your mind, but the hardest group to even get to consider going on a mission trip are pastors, and it has been.
Why is that?
I think we're so married to our congregation, our flock, and we just feel such a responsibility. We can't be away.
Yeah.
But it is true that, as we say, 95% of preachers are preaching to 5% of the world's population.
Wow.
If we could just get our pastors to participate on a mission trip and come back and lead their congregation, God's going to open the eyes of that pastor. He's going to discover, perhaps God is speaking to me about international missions, and he may end up on the national field or the international field.
Yeah. So same process, basically. Go
Right.
and see if God is calling you. So let me say this, and we'll close here in a second. For that person who's watching this, and they say, whether they're serving somewhere, whether they're new to the ministry in general, and they have prayed through this, they've gone on those mission trips, they've experienced missions, and they are coming to the conclusion that, yeah, maybe God is calling me to the ministry. And they're at that point of surrender. Maybe they've just surrendered. What would you say to that person?
I would say, if you're to that point, make an initial contact with someone. If you're considering international missions, make a contact with the International Mission Board. Start the process.
That's right. Plug them there, right? Plug them.
Yeah. But find someone who's a missionary or has been a missionary, someone that understands the struggle you're going through, that can answer those questions and help direct you in the right direction.
So find that person to help you continue through that process, what God's calling you to do. We got a little bit of time. Let me just ask you another question. What are some of the struggles of being on the mission field, whether it be internationally, whether it be domestically, just in general, that's unique to being a missionary? What are some of the struggles that you've faced, and what would you say to counteract those struggles?
Well, I'll say, for those who serve here in the United States as church planners, like you're going to do, finances is always a struggle.
If it's to be a poor church, I'm taking pastors out. Most of them say, "Let me buy your lunch. You're about to be a poor church planner."
Yeah.
So,
But that's a struggle. If you're trying to raise a family on a very limited budget, that was always a struggle. But when we went with International Mission Board, everything was provided for us. The struggles that you have on both fields are a sense of isolation, loneliness. We live 5 hours from our nearest family in Utah. That is 2 hours north of us.
yeah,
They live 2 hours north of us. So it was a long way to get together, have fellowship, spend time together.
yeah,
Isolation, loneliness, aging parents. When you're overseas, you have aging parents, failing health, and you can't be there
yeah,
with them. And then you have kids who you have to leave stateside, and you go back to the mission field. So there's a lot of family struggles there with
Yeah.
separation.
yeah. Wow. So, what would you say to that person, maybe who's on the mission field right now, watching this or gearing up for that? How would you say? What would be some advice with those people who are struggling with those different things, whether it be finances, whether it be um, uh, relationship things, family things, whatever it might be? What would you say?
I'd say you've got to make a decision. Is Jesus Christ the absolute Lord of your life? And are you willing to surrender your whole being and trust Him with your whole life? If you don't, you'll never be fulfilled and never be happy.
Wow.
And you have to give it all to Jesus. There's just no second best. It's either Jesus or second place. He's got to be first place.
Wow. Well, maybe I'll get you back on the show one day, Roger, soon, and we'll talk about what that total surrender to Jesus looks like, if He's really the Lord of our lives or not. And Man, this has been fun.
Yep.
I really enjoyed this, Roger. Man, I'm grateful for you to come and be a part of this. And listen, I'm so grateful that you're serving with us and a part of what God is doing through Redemption Church down in Pensacola. And man, you don't understand how much you and Miss Penny mean to me. And man, I told you, you've been at Ingomar for a few years, and I said to you, if God didn't bring you to Ingomar for any other reason, know that He brought you there for me to help me. And man, you are just an amazing man. I think so much of you and just your time that you've given to the Lord, your life you've given to Him, willing to go. And maybe I'll get you back on the show. We'll talk about
Okay.
more specifically some things in Brazil and maybe some more specific things in Ukraine, and maybe kind of talk about your ministry, what you're doing through Stacy Life Ministries.
All right.
So listen, thank you guys so much for watching today. Remember, if you'd like to stay up to date with what's going on, hit the subscribe button, like the video, share it. Really would help us out through the algorithm on YouTube. Share it on social media, and we really want to get the word out of what God is doing in the Pensacola area through Redemption Church. Remember, if you feel led to partner with us through prayer, through provision financially, or through participation, check us out on our website at www.redemptionchurchplanting.org. You can find more information on there, or you can click the link in the description box below. God bless you. We really hope to see you next week. I hope you have a great rest of your week in the Lord. Take care.